Robert Funk. The head of the Jesus Seminar, a seminar of 300 leading Christian scholars, not a sole scholar. Quote, "The Gospels, unlike most Greco-Roman writings, are anonymous. The familiar headings which give the name of an author, the Gospel according to, were not part of the original manuscripts, for they were added only early in the 2nd century. Added by whom? By unknown figures in the early church. In most cases, the names are guesses or perhaps the result of pious wishes. My words? No. His words. Again, I'm going to read the passage. Who added the names? Quote, by unknown figures in the early church. In most cases, the names are guesses or perhaps the result of pious wishes."
Another feature in gospel studies that's often raised is the idea that the authors who are associated with gospels didn't really write the gospels that they're associated with. So the claim is Matthew didn't write Matthew, John didn't write John, Mark didn't write Mark, and Luke didn't write Luke. The claim is made, and this is correct, that no gospel names its author. That's true. If you read through any one of the 4 gospels, at no point do we get, like we get in the Pauline letters, Paul, a slave of Jesus Christ, writing to such and such a church. We don't have anything like that in the Gospels. So we have to reconstruct who the author is. And the question is, how far back does this tradition go? We know that, that the claims associated with it reach at least into the latter part of the 2nd century, because Irenaeus mentions the 4 Gospels and gives their names as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The question is he right? Well, we actually know from the reports we get from Eusebius about Papias that these associations go back to somewhere between the latter part of the 1st century and the beginning part of the 2nd century, within a couple of decades of when these Gospels were actually written. Because Papias reports on Mark being associated as the interpreter of Peter, Matthew being a writer of a Gospel in the Hebrew dialect, in a Hebrew context, Luke being the writer of his Gospel, and John being associated with the 4th Gospel. So this takes us pretty far back. But for once, let's flip the claim, and let's look at the alternative model. The alternative model is that the names we attach to these Gospels are attached to them in order to raise the status of the Gospel in question. In other words, rather than have it be anonymous, attach it to the name of a luminary, someone who will bring credibility to this work, and thereby kind of undergird and support the testimony in what is really an anonymous gospel. Well, let's ask ourselves if that model really works. And I'm not going to pick the examples of the 2 gospels that are associated with apostles to work with this. I'm going to pick the examples with the two figures who are recognized not to be apostles. That is Mark and Luke. Let's take them one at a time. Mark. Think about Mark's resume, his CV, if you will. His CV is that he didn't make it through the first missionary journey. He went home to mama because the pressure got to be so great. Second part of his CV is that he caused a split between Paul and Barnabas before they went out in ministry. Now, does this sound like a figure who you're going to commend as the author to undergird the support of a gospel? If you're going to put in a name, remember that name is X, so you can put anyone in there you want. And yet Mark goes in there. Mark doesn't commend itself as one of these luminaries who can lift up the credibility of a gospel. Well, someone could come along and say, well, it isn't just Mark, it's Mark connected to Peter, and so it's really Peter who's behind this. Well, that's interesting, because if you can put in any name in an X, including an apostle, and that's the claim for Matthew and John, then why not just put Peter in there and solve your credibility problem? Go instantly to the luminary. The gospel tradition doesn't do that. It makes it very clear Mark's responsible for the gospel, but he interacted with Peter in producing it. It seems to me that this gives evidence that the gospel tradition is trying to be very careful about how it states its origins and doesn't jump the gun in terms of credibility. Now let's do the same thing for Luke in relationship to the third gospel. Luke is often associated with the third gospel, and he is often presented as Paul's representative. So the third gospel is usually associated with Paul in one way or another. Again, think through the candidates of who could go into the X slot, other than Luke, who could work with Paul and who would give that gospel potential credibility if you could pick a name out of the hat. Barnabas, Timothy, Titus, Silas, Apollos. There are all kinds of people who have all kinds of stronger background to bring to the lifting up of the credibility than Luke, who basically was an unknown disciple and may have been a doctor in the background, about whom we know very little else. So again, the point is, does the lifting up of the luminary going into the X slot, does that alternative explanation actually work? And the answer is, when you take a close look at it, no, it really doesn't. Which then raises the question, why do these somewhat obscure figures, or even people with questionable histories, end up being associated as the authors of these works? It's more likely that it's because the tradition knew something about the authorship of these books, and that's what was passed on.
According to EHRMAN, quote, Moses did not write the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not write the Gospels. Furthermore, quote, of the 27 books of the New Testament, only 8 almost certainly go back to the author whose name they bear. The 7 undisputed letters of Paul and the revelation of John, although we don't know which John this was. So, only Matthew and John, in the first case, were disciples anyway. If we look at our Bibles, we find that the verses of Luke 6:14 through 16 and Matthew 10:2 through 4 enumerate the lists of the disciples. Luke and Mark do not make the lists. So even if the Gospels were written by those upon whose name they are labeled, Luke and Mark were not true disciples. There is good reason to believe that John did not write John and Matthew did not write Matthew, even though they were disciples. What are those good reasons? Well, one of the good reasons is that it is recorded in Christian sources that John the disciple died on or around 98 CE. However, the gospel was written in 110. This is not according to Muslim scholars, this is according to Christian scholars. Acts 4:13 tells us that John and Peter were, quote, unlettered, illiterate. How can you write a gospel if you are unlettered? To this end, Graham Stanton poses a compelling question. Quote, was the eventual decision to accept Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John correct? Today it is generally agreed that neither Matthew nor John was written by an apostle, and Mark and Luke may not have been associates of the apostles. Professor Bart D. Ehrman is even more direct. Quote, critical scholars are fairly united today in thinking that Matthew did not write the first gospel or John the fourth, that Peter did not write 2 Peter and possibly not 1 Peter. No other book of the New Testament claims to be written by one of Jesus's earthly disciples. There are books by the Apostle of Paul, of course. 13 go by his name in the New Testament, at least 7 of which are accepted by nearly all scholars as authentic. read between the lines. He is saying 13 of Paul's books, out of those 13, 7 are accepted as authentic. What does that say about the other 6? It is saying that the other 6 are not accepted as authentic. 6 out of 13, basically half. Regarding copying errors, we have to expect that most were unintentional, many were inconsequential, but all the same, BART EHRMAN tells us that many others were not only deliberate, but they were significant. In fact, they were doctrinally motivated. And this is the scriptural alteration that we care about. Because if we find that the scriptures have been altered according to doctrinal motivation, we have to understand that this is the judgment of a human being, not the strict, faithful recording of revelation from God. Let's look at some examples. If we look at those verses which appear not only to be altered, but in fact transformed, look first at Acts 8:37. Does anybody know what Acts 8:37 says? Has anybody ever read Acts 8:37 in the Bible? I will answer for you. No. Nobody knows, and with relative certainty, I can say nobody here has read it. Why? Because it's empty. Any Bible you pick up, you will find that it lists 837 in its numbers. It goes 836, 837, 838, but 837 is left blank. Why? Because it is so well recognized among scholars that Acts 8:37 was an insertion that they do not even translate it. Similarly, Acts 15:34 is enumerated, but because it is unquestionably inserted by copyists, the judgment of Bruce Metzger, it is not translated in any of the modern faithful Bibles. Are these two lone examples? No. Matthew 17:21. 18:11. Mark 7:16. (944), 946. (1126). part of Luke 9:56. (1736). (23:17). Don't copy all of this down. It's all in my notes. You will find it on my websites. But the fact is, whether you are looking at the first epistle of John, whether you are looking at John 5:1, Romans 16:24, you will find that these verses are enumerated and all or part of them are not translated. Why? Because modern Christian scholarship has recognized that they are undeniably insertions by a copyist. And if we recognize that those verses are insertions, how can we trust any others? Now, despite all the evidence to the contrary, many Christians will still say, well, but the Bible is the Word of God. You can present all of the evidence that I have presented, and you will still find some Christians who have been raised upon the thought to believe that the Bible is the Word of God, and they cannot let go of the concepts that they have been indoctrinated to believe.